Welcome back to Just Code China. Please support us by subscribing to our channel and click on the like button. If you are new to React Native and have not watched our first tutorial video, please do so by click on the link provided below. Today's agenda, we will cover the following topics. First, the app structure. We will discuss the folder and file structure of React Native app. Next, we will discuss the UI components. Followed by, we will discuss the component state. Last but not least, we will show you how to handle the UI events. As usual, in this series of videos, we assume that you have some basic programming knowledge, preferable JavaScript. Today's tutorial will be a long session. Therefore, we will split into two videos, 2A and 2B. In the first video, we will cover the above agenda in theory. And in the second video, we will perform a hands-on session to create a real-world application. First, let us take a look at the folder structure of the React Native. The test folder is used to hold the test script for the application. The bug config is used to configure the bug building system, which is developed and used by Facebook. The ESLint RC is used to configure the ESLint tool. ESLint is a tool for identifying and reporting on patterns found in ECMA script JavaScript code to make code more consistent and avoiding bugs. The flow config is used to configure the flow tool, which is the static type checker for your JavaScript code. It does a lot of work to make you more productive, make your code faster, smarter, more confidently, and to a bigger scale. Next is the git attribute. It is used to configure the path attribute for Gits. Gits is a free and open source distributed version control system designed to handle everything from a small to a large project with speed and efficiency. The git ignore is used to configure what file or path to be ignored by Git. The prettier RC is used to configure the code formatting. Prettier is a code formatter that enforces a consistent code style across your entire code base. The Watchman config is used to configure the Watchman tool we had installed in our previous video. Watchman is a tool from React Native that monitors file change in the project directory. The above files that begin with the period are used to configure the app building, code checking, formatting, and version controlling. We will not go into detail on this configuration file in this video. Using the default configuration generated by React Native is sufficient for now. Next is the Android folder. This folder will hold the native Android project file and all the source code generated by React Native. This is the folder used to compile the native APK file for the Android platform. We normally don't change the content of this folder. When we install new module for the project, React Native will update this folder automatically. Occasionally, we do edit the content of this folder for certain native module. Followed by is the app.js. It is the main application.js file. It creates the necessary components to bootstrap the entire application. The app.json holds the name of the application. The Mabel.config.js is used to configure the Mabel, which is a toolchain that is mainly used to convert ECMA script 2015 code into a backward-compatible version of JavaScript in the current or older browser or environment. The index.js is the entry point of the app. When the application launches, it will load the index.js and execute it first. The index.js will then load the application.js to bootstrap the entire application. Next is the iOS folder. This folder will hold a native iOS project and all the source code generated by the React Native. This is a folder used to compile the native IPA file for iOS platform. Similar to the Android folder, we seldom need to modify the content of this folder, only when install certain native module. The Metro config is used to configure the Metro bundle. Metro is a JavaScript bundler for React Native. The Node module is a folder that holds all React Native and third-party JS npm modules. The package.json contains all the npm package and its version we have installed for our application. The package log.json is automatically generated when we install or remove npm package for our application. The above structure is created when we use React Native to generate the blank project template. It assumes all the application logic will be reset in the app.js. However, in a real-world application, it is not practical to have all logic in a single file. We need to have multiple folders and files to contain the application screen, reusable custom component, helper function, etc. We would recommend a few additional folders to hold the respective file. For example, we will have the source components folder to hold all custom components. This includes the login control, customize date picker, range picker, etc. Followed by is the source lib folder. It will hold all the helper API function and constant definition. We'll also have a source screen folders to hold all the screen or page component. Next is the source theme folder. It will hold all the common style definition to be used by our application. Now, let us take a look at the file structure. Please take note that in React Native, all screen and UI control are components. All components have the same lifecycle. We will cover that later. It's also important to know that there are two ways to implement a component, and they are the class component and functional component. Regardless of the type of implementation, they have a similar structure. At the beginning of the file, we will import other modules that are required by the component. For example, we need to import React module for our application to work. We might also need to import module from the library folder to make the API call in our component. Next is the component definition. It can either be a class or functional component. A component definition includes the logic and the UI layout. In React Native, we use a UI markup language called JSX. It allows you to define the UI within your JavaScript source instead the need to have a separate UI definition file. The component will also handle all the events generated by the user interaction. The last part is the style definition. It can be within the same file as the component or in a separate file. In normal practice, the in-page style definition is used within a single component. For the common style, it should be defined in a separate file, and the file should be placed in the source theme folder. Now, let us take a look at the difference between the class and functional component. A class component are JavaScript ES2015 classes that extend a base class from React called component. A class component can access to React Lifecycle methods that render as well as state props functionality from the parent. From the example, we have a component named Hello World that extends from the React component-based class. Within a component, it may contain a constructor, React Lifecycle methods, for example, the component will mount, and a render method to return the UI. When the class component is loaded by the React Native engine, it will first fire the component's constructor, if defined. Next, it will fire the respective lifecycle method, for example, the component will bound method. Last but not least, the engine will fire the render method to return the UI to be displayed. Now, let us take a look at the component lifecycle. First is the component initialize lifecycle. This is the lifecycle when the component is first created. The first method to execute is the constructor. This is where you initialize your component and its state. This is the only place where you can set the state directly without using the setState function. Next is the component while method. This method only called once at the start of the component before render. You can change the state of the component here using the built-in setState method and perform the task to get data locally or remotely. Please note that if you navigate the page from A to B and back to A again, the component while for page A will not fire again. Followed by is the render method. This method renders the component UI with the assigned state and prop. You should avoid calling setState here, as it triggers render again, which will lead to an infinite loop. Next is the component bound method. This method is called after the render has complete and only for the first time. If you alter the component state here, the render method will be triggered again. Please take note that all lifecycle methods are optional except the render method. For example, if you didn't define the constructor method, the React Native engine will execute the default constructor for the component. Next, let us take a look at the lifecycle when the component state props are updated. The first method is the component will receive props. This method is called when there is a change in the props passed from the parent, so the component can re-render. Next is the should component update method. This method normally used to avoid unwanted re-render for better performance. So, based on the received new props, you can decide whether to update the component or not. Followed by is the component will update method. This is called when the should component update return true. You should not modify the component state in this method. Next is the render method. This is the same render method we had discussed earlier. Followed by is the component did update method. This method is called after the re-render had completed. You can, but you should avoid calling setState here. The reason is your app might go into infinite loop without proper conditioning, which eventually cause your application to crash. The last method is the component will unmount, which is not shown in the slide. It is called before unmounting destroy the component. This is where you can unregister all listener, call disposer, etc. Till now, in this tutorial, I have mentioned the term props and state. You might ask, what is that? So, what are props? Props is the short form for properties. It is the properties for the components. Properties are immutable within the component. This means that your component cannot change the value of its properties. Properties can only be passed from the parent to the child components. This means that property acts as a parameter for the parent component to pass information to the child component, and only the parent component can change the value of the properties for the child components. Properties are a mechanism that make your component reusable. For example, we can have a component to display product details. This component gets the product details data from the parent component, a product list page, via the value passed in the component properties. This component can be used in other pages, like the shopping cart page. Within your components, you can define a default value for the property if the parent component didn't pass in any value. You can access the properties via the this.props followed by the property name. Let us take a look at an example on the props. In this example, we have a component called the product list. Within product list, the render methods call the child component product details. The product list pass in the product information via the property name detail. Now, at the product detail component render method, it accesses the product detail by this.props.detail property. The SKU, name, and price are the field of the detail properties object. At the product detail prop tabs, you can see that we define the detail property should be an object tab. At the product detail.default properties, we define the default value for detail properties by setting the SKU and name to empty string and 0 to the price. If you are new to React and React Native, you might wonder what is the strange syntax at the return statement in the render method. This syntax is called JSX. We have come across this term in the React Native architecture in tutorial 1. JSX stands for JavaScript XML. JSX allows us to write markup elements in JavaScript and place them in the DOM without any create element and or append child method. It converts markup text into object within the React Native engine. To make things easier for you, you can treat that each tag is an object, and the attribute within the text will be passed to the respective component as properties. Each nested tag is the child object of the parent text. JSX is an extension of the JavaScript language based on ES6 and is translated to regular JavaScript at runtime. Now, let us look at what is component state. State in React Native is used within component to keep track information. It is normally used to keep track of information that will change based on time or user action. For example, we can use a state to store user ID and password before submitting it to the server to perform authentication. You cannot directly change the state, like in the constructor. You need to call a setState to change its value. Calling setState will re-render the component and all the child components. This is useful as we don't have to worry about writing event handler that like other language to update the UI. One thing to take note is React Native only perform a one-way binding. This means that the value in the state will automatically update the UI. However, if the user makes any change on the UI, for example, a text box, the amend value will not be updated back to the state. You need to define the event handler to update the changes. The component state is private within the component. This means that component A state is not accessible by component B. This is to protect the component state from accidentally changed by another component. However, in large-scale application, this is a major drawback when components need to share information. Even you can pass the state to a child component via props, but it will be troublesome when there is too many nested components. One way to resolve this issue is to use the Redux framework, which we will discuss in the future tutorial. To make things simple, you can imagine that state is a global variable that stores information within a component. However, you need a setter method, setState, to change the value. To access the component state, we simply use this.state followed by the state name. Now, let us use an example to illustrate the component state. In this example, we have a login form component. At the component's constructor, we initialize the state to an object that holds the user ID and password field. Please take note that the component constructor should always call the super method to initialize the parent component. Followed by, we define two event handler methods to handle value change due to user action. In the render method, we destructure the state into individual variable so that the text input component can just refer it as a simple variable instead of the state object. Remember, this is only one-way binding. To update the state when the user changes the value, we need to assign handler to each of the text input on change text event. Let us go through the program flow. When login form component is created, we will initialize the state via the constructor. Then, the render method will display the UI with two empty text boxes. If the user tap on the user ID input text box and start typing, the onChange text event will fire the handler user ID change handler. The new value keyed in by the user will be available in the text parameter in the handler. We call the setState to update the user ID state with the new value. After the setState is invoked, the React Native engine will fire the render method again, and the UI will re-render with the latest value in the state. Now, let us take a look at functional components. Functional components are simpler. They don't manage their own state or have access to lifecycle methods provided by React Native. They are literally JavaScript functions. They are also known as stateless components. The function definition syntax might seem strange if you are not familiar with the JavaScript ES6 syntax. It is called arrow function and is introduced in JavaScript ES6 version. To understand the syntax in this example, you can read the code this way. We define a constant called hello world, and it is assigned to a function that takes in 0 parameter, and the function logic is within the curly brace. Technically, there are some difference between normal JavaScript function and ES6 arrow function. We will cover that in other series of tutorial video. From the example, we have a method named hello world that will return the UI element since it is just a method. Therefore, it doesn't have the constructor and lifecycle method. In the next video, we are going to create a real-world application rather than a simple hello world application to illustrate how we program in React Native. We are going to create a dictionary app. This app will accept a word from user input and look up its definition from the Oxford Dictionary API. This app will also read out the word the user has looked up. We will end this part of tutorial video for now. Please watch the next video to have a hands-on session. Do support us by like our video, click on the subscribe button and the notification bell. See you in the next video. Bye.